Hello, everybody. I have Dr. Peter Salerno back on the show today. He has a new book coming out about trauma cognitive dissonance, and we're going to discuss that among many other things that sometimes can be a little controversial, but that's what makes it fun. How are you today, Dr. Salerno?
I'm doing great. How are you, Jared?
I'm living the dream over here. Happy to have you on again.
Yeah.
What made you decide to write this book about trauma cognitive dissonance?
So this book is kind of a follow-up to my Narcissism book that I released. That one is kind of, an unconventional information about narcissism that's less known, less popular. And it kind of leaves you with the question, okay, now I know this. Let's say I subscribe to this or I endorse this view. Now what? And so traumatic cognitive dissonance is the book is basically how to heal from a relationship with a disordered personality, how to identify if you're in one, and then what to do about, protecting yourself and healing from the resulting trauma.
And what is your definition of trauma cognitive dissonance?
Yeah, so cognitive dissonance started off as just like a social learning theory term that didn't really have anything to do with trauma. But when we talk about all of the manipulation that takes place in the context of a relationship with a pathological personality, then we're starting to see that there's this intentional desire to cause a person to no longer have a solid foundation on their reality, on what's true and what's not. And so that creates this effect. And so traumatic cognitive dissonance, it's not a diagnostic term, it's just a descriptive term that kind of explains the after effect of being under chronic manipulation, coercion, subterfuge, all of this type of stuff that takes place. And typically, because it's chronic in nature, it's because you're with somebody who's chronically manipulating. So it's not necessarily situational kind of a thing. It's part of the fiber of the relationship itself. So that kind of then implies that there's at least one pathological personality in the dynamic if it's going to be this enduring, pervasive pattern of manipulation.
So, for someone who is experiencing trauma cognitive dissonance, what do you think is the hardest thing for them to recognize what's going on and the hardest things to do the action steps to get out?
Yeah, well, if you don't mind, I kind of wanted to read just a couple of I had a few quotes in my book from people that I've worked with who have described this phenomenon, and it's like eerily similar in people from all walks of life, all over the world, and they're basically talking about as a victim, they are left so confused after like this abuse, they blame themselves and they still don't really know if they were in fact abused. So that's one of the
Mm.
main features of this. So for example, one person said, it's been over 5 years since my divorce was finalized, but that didn't really finalize anything. I still don't know whether I was the problem or not. I'm driving myself crazy trying to figure it out. My mind won't stop racing. It won't shut off. Another person said, I feel the constant need to retaliate and prove something, but that's never been me. How do I get people to believe me, to believe what happened to me? And then it shifts to, well, maybe I'm not remembering correctly.
Mm.
And so so many people have this same experience where they're just left knowing something was terribly wrong and felt wrong for a long time. And then they also don't have the ability to be confident in themselves that they didn't contribute to it or that they were in fact experiencing abuse. So that's
And
pretty
it is
much.
wild, especially after years down the line, 5 years later in that one case, and that's still how they're thinking, second guessing themselves. And it's from the prolonged gaslighting effect, too, right? They've been convinced it's just all their fault. They're the problem. They're always guilty of something. And this is the impact of it.
Absolutely. And then another issue with this is this idea of trauma bonds, don't break after no contact. That's not how it works. You could go 15, 20, 30 years, with no contact. Just because there's no physical proximity and there's no actual interaction, that doesn't mean that you're not you can stay stuck in that mode, feeling paralyzed and immobilized by these relationships. So
Sure. And that's where the trauma is frozen in them, right? And that's where they're going to need something like EMDR. And what are the other approved trauma therapies to get that trauma out?
yeah, so there's EMDR, which obviously is, internationally known. It's very popular. Another one that's kind of up and coming that is similar to it because it uses the eye movement technique is something called accelerated resolution therapy. And that one's relatively new, but it's sort of is kind of promising to do things in a more accelerated manner, even more accelerated than EMDR, which is already rapid processing for a lot of people. And that one actually states that the premise of it is that you don't actually have to relive the trauma to get past it. So that's pretty appealing because a lot of people feel like they're re-traumatized when they have to. Another one that's very popular that's just as efficacious is something called cognitive processing therapy, which is more of a structured, like 12 session therapy. Each session has an agenda, and it's also designed to help people get unstuck and challenge these beliefs that developed as a result of trauma that are not necessarily accurate, but that are keeping them, stuck in the past and believing things about themselves that aren't true. So that's a good one. There's, other ones, even the classic prolonged exposure therapy. A lot of people don't like that. They feel like it's too brutal because it prolongs the exposure to the trauma, but it is effective. It's just everybody has a different nervous system, so they need to find out which one works best for them. It's not like a one size fits all,
Sure. And I guess it's a slippery slope for people trying to not re-traumatize themselves. And you have to be with a professional that knows what they're doing with this, because it is a slippery slope there. It's like, okay, you're going to be there with them, trying to get them to relive the experience without also re-traumatizing them. How do they go about doing that? Like not re-traumatizing them through the process?
So I guess it would depend on how we define re-traumatizing. I think there needs to be a bit of, trust in the process, and there needs to be trust in the individual that you're working with. So there needs to be this rapport building and this element of, I trust that this person can keep me safe, even if things come up. I think there also does need to be a willingness to be, reactivated. I mean, so part of this is having to face it, even if it's very difficult. And one of the one trauma symptom is avoiding things that, make you recall the trauma. So it's getting past that and learning that, like, just because you're thinking about something that was really painful doesn't mean that you're in any danger anymore. So kind of perspective building and resource building, and then just a safe person that you trust, I think kind of gives you that nudge to, to face it. And I think, oftentimes part of the process is that because you're reliving this and recalling it, you're gonna be reactivated. It doesn't have to be necessarily overwhelming and devastating, but it certainly has to be, you have to walk toward it, so to speak.
Sure. Do you see any differences between how men and women process their trauma?
That's a good question. Well, I guess speaking just from experience in my clinical practice, the presentation of it certainly is different. I think that not to make too big of generalizations, but it seems like men are more or less inclined to volunteer information. They're more hesitant to go into detail. Not that all women just go in and say everything that comes to mind, but I think women trust, it seems like they trust the process a bit more maybe. So their vulnerability is they're already at a place where they're more comfortable with being vulnerable. And sometimes men require a little bit more of a nudge.
Yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. I think because men, I do think they'll process emotions differently sometimes. And the same thing I would imagine with trauma as well, where I think a lot of guys are more solutions oriented. And when they do actions, it gets them into a good place. And I guess as long as they're not spiritually bypassing in the process, I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, and I think too, and that, to your point, when people when men, reach out to work with me, they often do sort of come with this, okay, here's the problem. I can't fix it. I thought I could. What do I do? And it's very much solution focused in that
Right.
way. Like, just you can tell me what I need to do or how I need to think about it. And so there's definitely less of that wanting to, I shouldn't say less wanting to, but it's the processing component, kind of comes later once they realize, they're allowed to talk about their feelings and talk
Sure.
about these things.
And I guess for a lot of guys, they just hesitate to even get help to begin with, a lot of times, especially when it comes to trauma. But one of the few pain points that does push them over the edge are dating issues and
Yeah.
issues with like narcissistic or borderline women. Of all the things that push them, that's one of the big ones that does.
Yeah. Well, because those are pretty, dramatic and severe situations. And so it's hard to recover from that. I mean, you can feel like you've been, spun, and it's difficult to understand, figure out which way is up after those types of relational dynamics. So,
Absolutely. And then you have that gaslighting effect, etc.
Mhm.
And I guess what I would call that is we have to unsubscribe from
Mhm.
that whole reality. And part of that unsubscribing process is learning to trust yourself again. It's
Yes.
learning to trust your perception of reality. And when you do that, truly do that, to me, that's one of the best ways, other than healing the trauma parts, to
Mhm.
get to trust yourself again, to get rid of that trauma cognitive dissonance and that prolonged gaslighting effect.
100%. I think that the healing that comes, I think that what needs to be healed in trauma is, like you just said, it's basically your beliefs about yourself need to be restored the way they were prior to, the relationship with the person who distorted them. And so it's really all about, you know, believing what's accurate about yourself again and restoring those beliefs that have been compromised for however long you were in the relationship. And that will give you the confidence to make better decisions in the future, I think, with relationships, and also just be a little bit more self-caring and self-compassionate
Sure.
in the long run.
Now, my friend P Dubs here, she has a question. I could see how prolonged exposure would be really hard, but potentially effective. Is it the same idea as desensitization?
Yeah. So you're right. It's harder because it's like the least, well, there's no shortcuts. So, but yeah, ultimately the goal is to eventually desensitize through the continuous exposure, the cumulative exposure. What you're doing is you're facing something so many times that it no longer has that emotional charge, that effect. And so you get this evidence that you've survived it by facing it over and over again, and then it just becomes less scary.
I like that. I think it's kind of like how people would want to try to own something so that if, like, maybe for example, like think of the worst case scenario in something. When they do that and you try to own what possibly could be the worst case scenario,
Mhm.
you disempower the whole thing. And I
Right.
think that's part of what goes on with that. It's like you desensitize yourself and you disempower it when you really get familiar with it and you're owning the dynamic, owning what happened. Not to say it's your fault, but
Right.
you're just getting okay with it and accepting it.
I agree. And I think it's very empowering to, do the long haul. I think these other, also, I don't want to, mislead people into thinking that these other therapies are like somehow shortcuts. There's just a different mechanism, but a lot of people prefer prolonged exposure for that very reason that you just said. I remember seeing one therapist on a TED Talk saying, I would never subject my clients to prolonged exposure. It's torture and it's abusive and it shouldn't be, it's unethical. I mean, I disagree. I think that some people thrive, through that process, even though it's very challenging. And then other people just have, like I said, different nervous systems that maybe require a different intervention. It's not necessarily one's better than the other, but some are more effective for different people for different reasons.
Sure. And I think so much of it is just the delivery and how the professional
Mhm.
brings it up to the client. It's like you're not going to force feed them this method if they don't want to do it. But
Right.
if you deliver it in a way of like, hey, I've heard people had success with this. If you're down to try it, I'm here for you and we can try to do this together. But it's not like, oh, you need to do it this way because if
Yeah.
you don't do it this way, you're not healing properly. It's like, no, forget all that. That controlling element of
Yeah.
the healers, which you do see a lot of that. You see a lot of that amongst the spirituality folks and religious folks. Sometimes it's like, you
Mhm.
have to do it this way.
Right. And a lot of people do promote that idea that there is only one way. So sometimes you'll get people, I don't know if you've experienced this in when you help people, they hear something works and they want you to do that with them or and it's like, well, why do you like, for example, for me, I will ask, why do you want to try EMDR over something else? Like, where did you hear about it? And a lot of times I get the response, which it's nobody's fault. They wouldn't know otherwise, but it's like, well, I heard that that's the only science-based, you know, intervention and that it works really fast and I want to do it. And it's like, okay, well, let's talk about some other options because that's not necessarily true. Sometimes people do experience some rapid healing and processing, and then other people, it, doesn't necessarily work the first time as well as they thought. And so that can be discouraging. So it's just good to have a variety uh, of options when you're trying to help people.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And this kind of reminds me of something else. The differences between trauma, people who are traumatized and their defense mechanisms versus the defense mechanisms of maybe a narcissist or a borderline or someone who has a personality disorder. Could you explain some of the differences between them?
So we all utilize defense mechanisms to cope with discomfort or distress or any other emotional experience. And these are, some of them are more conscious than others. And so sometimes we have this sort of instinct to defend in a way that's sort of reactive, right? And so we have tons of names for these defense mechanisms: projection, projective identification, justification, denial, etc. When your nervous system is detecting threat. So if there's a perception of threat in the nervous system, which that's basically what trauma is, it's a perception of threat in the nervous system. When your nervous system is perceiving threat, you're going to defend yourself in some way. And so oftentimes when people are experiencing a social threat, they're going to rely on one of these mechanisms to protect themselves from a perceived threat or an actual threat. When you have a pathological personality, they will utilize defense mechanisms, but they actually will intentionally use them as offense mechanisms, not because
Mm,
fear's been activated, but because there's a threat of a character flaw being exposed. There's a threat of image management no longer being managed by them, right? They're not fully in control. And so they will utilize similar defenses to externalize responsibility, but it's not necessarily that they're protecting themselves from a fear of anything.
right.
Yeah.
And this reminds me of these terms I'm about to say have fallen out of favor a little bit, but it's the difference between neurotic versus character disordered people, right? Where neurotic people, to me, they do things in a particular way. They often will blame themselves for things. They
Yep.
often don't have a good sense of self-worth. They second guess themselves. They're just not as confident. Like those are the people that I would describe as neurotic, and that's part of the
Yes.
definition of neurotic. But then on the other hand, you'll see people who are more character disordered. And these are the people that are usually more assertive, if not aggressive.
Mhm.
These are the people that are more sure of themselves, are confident. And to me, it's a pretty good way to differentiate because there's like, for example, people pleasers will be neurotic in a way. And some people will also try to say, oh, narcissism can be like a people pleasing thing too. And I'm like, well, like, I don't know. It'd be a different version of people pleasing if that's the case, the
Mhm.
character disordered version of people pleasing. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think those terms are still very relevant today. Neurotic basically implies that someone has an internal conflict of some kind. And so people who are emboldened, like you described, a character disordered person, they're not having any internal conflict in those moments. They're actually very pleased with themselves. They're very confident. They're comfortable with themselves. So they're not experiencing this conflict in their emotional states. It's more just like, I'm right, you're wrong, end of story. And I'll defend myself because I'm right, but not because I'm scared. People who are neurotic second guess themselves. They have self-doubt. They mistrust. They think it's their fault. They identify flaws in themselves. So there's definitely a significant difference between somebody who's neurotic. And one of my points in my narcissism book, and just in my material in general, is the theories, the psychological theories that we've like clung to for the last 100 years are designed to treat neurotics, people with internal conflict. They're not designed to help people who don't believe they have a problem. So they don't work with people who don't believe they have a problem. And so even trauma theories, people understand something doesn't feel right, about the way that I'm experiencing myself, others, the world. A narcissist doesn't believe that they're not feeling right. They believe everything's feeling great. It's only when someone confronts them with a problem that things don't feel right. But in their mind, it's still not them. It's just that somebody confronted them with a problem. That's the problem, right? So that's not an internal conflict at all.
Do you think it's possible for a narcissist to also be neurotic?
I think that it's not related to the narcissism. I would say that narcissists, psychopaths, borderline personalities all have traits that are not excessive or deficient. So they're not like on a pathological level. I mean, they have normal traits just as much, as well as abnormal traits. So it's possible that a narcissist could have a tendency to be neurotic, but it's not related to the narcissism, if that makes sense. Now,
Okay.
borderline personalities have such high negative affect that they actually do experience a lot of neurotic traits. It's part of the, the disorder, the trait profile.
Right. And that's something I've seen Dr. George Simon say too, where he says there's borderlines who are neurotic, but then there's also borderlines who are character disordered. And some of them, they'll fall into either end of the spectrum there, but they can be either.
Well, I don't know. I think you read my narcissism book, and I used my maternal grandmother as an example in that one. Yep. She was the kind of borderline that was character disordered. She was extremely mean and very okay with being mean to people. And it was never her fault. So, yeah.
And I mean, a good example of that's like Livia Soprano from The Sopranos, right? Tony Soprano's mother. If you're familiar with the series, that's probably what she was.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so she was that kind of, but it was like covert too. And the covert ones, they can be really tricky with it because sometimes they'll bad talk themselves. They'll say, oh, I'm such a piece of crap. I can't get anything right. Woe's me. I kind of call it the Eeyore routine. Yes. But it is impression management though, too. It's not just like that's truly what it is. It's like, now they're manipulating here a little bit too. It's tricky.
Yeah, that's ingratiating. So what they'll do is they'll throw themselves under the bus if it means it's going to find them favor in some way. It's not necessarily an admission of guilt or responsibility, or even an admission or even a feeling of remorse or guilt or regret. It's more like, if I do this, I'll get what I want.
And you see that a lot. I see that a lot amongst like certain content creators. They'll do that, like, because they know, oh, if I act this way, I'm going to get all sorts of attention, admiration, and acknowledgement, and that's what I want. And so it can be pretty tricky out there.
Absolutely. Yeah, the covert stuff is the trickiest because, there's not physical evidence of the harm. And so people are constantly, spinning in their mind as to try and figure out what's real and what's not. And did this really happen? And am I interpreting this properly? And then you have the manipulator telling you, you got it wrong, you're overreacting, or you're misinterpreting. So it's brutal.
Yeah, I mean, often the quote unquote nice guys, they would be some of the ones that I would consider covert narcissists sometimes, because they're always on that, I'm such a good guy, I'm such a nice guy, everyone should like me. But it's like, if you really are the nice guy, is that what you have to say? It's
Yeah.
like my friend Kelly always says, that if you have blonde hair, you have to say to everybody, look, I have blonde hair, look, I
Right.
have blonde hair. It's like, no, you're going to let your actions show it.
Right. Absolutely.
So the other thing you made me think of there as you were talking, you mentioned how sometimes when narcissists go to therapy, they can actually get worse. And I think you mentioned in there some of the reason, but why is that?
Well, if we treat narcissism like a symptomatic condition where they're coming in and there's these symptoms that were we're not always there, let's say. They developed as a result of experience or, environmental influence, and now they're causing distress and impairment. If you treat them like that, then you're going to try to make something go away that was always there and that's always going to be there. So we can't treat narcissism as a symptomatic condition because it's rooted in a biologically based temperament with a trait profile. And it's sort of like, it's no different than trying to treat introversion or extroversion as a symptom. Like, you can't go to a therapist and get, your introversion desensitized. I mean, you can find ways to become more comfortable with being an introvert, but for the most part, there are some factors there that are pretty stable over time. And people typically don't go to therapy for something like that. You could go to therapy for a symptomatic condition like trauma, or like a mood condition like depression or anxiety, and those symptoms can be alleviated through those interventions. But when we're talking about narcissism, we're talking about persistent, enduring traits that are, stable over time. I think there's some wiggle room to modify them to a degree in some, but that requires a lot of collaboration on their part. And we know that they're not very collaborative people.
No,
So
definitely not.
So treating them, or like even history oriented therapies where, like, let's delve into the past of this person and see where this originated. You'll spend 30 years with a narcissist talking about their past, and they will gladly talk about their past all day long to people because that's part of their attention seeking and, validation that they're looking for, confirmation more than validation.
Sure.
But those interventions don't work. Also, what I've noticed is people have reported that when they've, entered into couples therapy with somebody who has a disordered personality, it gives them more of a toolkit to manipulate. And so the relationship gets more manipulative. It gets worse. It could potentially become more violent. So historically, treating disordered personalities with bad intentions, treating those individuals with these therapy techniques actually gives them more ammunition and makes them more skilled offenders.
I have actually seen that very thing where some of them will say, "Oh, I'm going to therapy, so I know I'm not the problem. It
Mm,
has to be you. I'm doing EMDR with my therapist." But meanwhile, like, that might help their trauma, but it's not helping that personality disorder in any
no,
way.
no,
And people get that confused too. It's like, just
yeah,
because the trauma didn't cause the narcissism doesn't mean that the narcissist can't also be traumatized. It's like,
right,
77% is the genetic component, and 23%, as you said in that other video, it doesn't even mean that 23% is all childhood trauma. There could be other factors in there too, besides just childhood trauma. So, but the narcissistic people, they're going to weaponize that. They're going to say, "Oh, I just got to get treatment for my trauma." But meanwhile, they're doing all of the same manipulative, exploitative, and character disordered things, where I'm thinking to myself, this person isn't changing at all in the meaningful ways they need to be. They're just going round and round in circles trying to treat their trauma.
and that's why it's important to pay attention to the reality that some of this has to do with, innate traits. Like, they're not. A trait isn't necessarily something that is 100% stable and unchangeable, but for the most part, you carry it with you wherever you go. Even non-pathological traits, those are pretty much considered to be the least changing aspect of the human psyche across the lifespan.
Sure.
There's you can work on changing them, but again, that requires commitment, collaboration, cooperation, and admitting that you need to in the first place, and that's where it becomes a big challenge. But people, yeah, there are narcissists who have comorbid conditions, and they've had their EMDR treatment, and it desensitized them and resolved their trauma symptoms, and they're just as narcissistic as ever, because those are completely separate.
And to me, I don't understand why people have such an issue with that part of it, but it seems pretty clear to me. It's like, yeah, that's a different thing. But I guess when they think it's just all caused by childhood trauma, they'll think, well, you heal the trauma, then the narcissism will get better. But it's like, no, not necessarily. And you see plenty of evidence to the contrary.
Yeah, and I think too, the term narcissism is used interchangeably to mean a lot of different things. And even the historical development of the term in psychology, it's changed over time. There wasn't always an NPD. There was just, at one time, there was primary narcissism and secondary narcissism, and those meant two different things, and they weren't disorders. So we have this history of, this evolution of psychological literature and using the term and borrowing that term even from mythology. It's very confusing to a lot of people. What does this actually mean? When I'm talking about it, I'm talking about the disorder of personality, or what you mentioned as a character disorder. I'm not talking about the possibility that some people can be, more self-interested or a little bit entitled as children. Like, that's not really what I would consider a narcissism that's even worth talking about. Because if that's all it is, then it'll just be naturally outgrown. I'm talking about this person really just doesn't care what other people's problems are. They don't identify with the needs and feelings of others. They're very disinterested in the feelings and needs of others. They're extremely arrogant. They're extremely confident, even when they don't have anything to show for it. They feel like they're entitled to special treatment. They expect it. Like, that's, and that's a longitudinal studies have shown that that's a way a person is. That's not something that happened to a person.
Right. And I think a lot of people get it mixed up too, that they'll say, oh, everyone's has some narcissistic traits. And I'm like, well, in the way that the DSM would describe, prolonged and over many areas of life, it's like, I don't think so. No. Not everyone has that entitlement, feelings of grandiosity and superiority, lack of empathy, entitlement, etc., and sensitivity, hypersensitivity to criticism. Like, no, not everyone has that.
No. And the insight. So I think when we use the term narcissism, the first thing we have to do when we're, if we're getting into a discussion with somebody, is define what you mean by narcissism before we even get into an argument, because we might be talking about completely different things. Right. I recently posted on the differences between depression and narcissism, how narcissists get pessimistic when they're distressed, not depressed all the time. And somebody who's depressed has a completely different presentation, and somebody got really upset about that. And I somehow they thought that I was saying that depressed people are narcissists. Before I even respond, we have to figure out, are we even talking about the same thing? Because I think we're actually agreeing. I just think the terminology is so misused that we're getting into an argument that doesn't need to be had,
I mean, people are very, very sensitive about the word narcissist being used in the same sentence with anything, whether it's CPTSD or ADHD or bipolar. It's like, if you even say the two in the same sentence, you're like, oh, you're comparing them to narcissists, and they're nothing like narcissists. It's like, there can be some appearing traits that look similar in some cases, is what I would say. But just the comparison shouldn't be that much of a problem to people. We're really just trying to help people clarify and understand the difference.
Absolutely. And there are overlapping features, and there are things that look very superficially similar in a lot of disorders. And mental health in general is, by nature going to be overlapping. It's not going to be these strict, categories. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just the way it is,
Sure. I mean, it's just the causes are going to be different too. Like
Correct.
the reason why someone with ADHD may do something is going to be a little different than the reason why a narcissist does it, although the effect is going to appear similar. Like the behavior may appear similar.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
The other thing I was thinking, where does the epigenetic component come into all of this? That is something I hear a lot of people mention.
Yeah. So this mechanism of gene regulation, turning genes on and off, right, with the environmental experience, it's not. First of all, it's not all that it's cracked up to be, because it means a lot of different things. There are different fields and different disciplines that use the term epigenetics differently. So it's not this, umbrella term to mean that, we're walking around all day long and our genes are turning on and off based on our environmental experience. And, that's the reason why people are narcissistic and stuff like that. Basically, it's not really this revolutionary idea either. And it really doesn't have anything to do with these innate traits. We have traits that are going to develop at the moment of conception, regardless, and some of those traits are like, a lot of, like, obviously no one contests physical traits have that, that effect. You don't think that your eye color is going to be different in 2 years from now if you're, in a bad environment. You're just gonna, that, like, I think it's 95% eye color is genetic, is heritable. So when it comes to epigenetics, there's this idea that we're constantly being influenced by our environment in such a way where our genes are turning on and off and shaping who we are. And that's just kind of more like myth. It's really not that powerful, and it doesn't replace like classical genetics at all. There's a couple of good resources for that if people want to disagree with my take on that and they want to go do some research. A guy named Kevin Mitchell has a really good, I think it's called Wiring the Brain. It's like a blog, and he talks a lot about epigenetics. He's a neuroscientist. And so if you want to, but he even talks about how the studies, the primary sources for all of this, epigenetic research, like really small sample sizes, and they're kind of like blown out of proportion to create generalizations. And then it's a great story. People want to believe that they can change everything about themselves. So yeah, like they want to hear that. And so it's kind of created this, this legend in and of itself that everything is shapeable and malleable. A lot of things are, but if that were the case, then we would see narcissists popping up at the age of 80 based on their and we don't see narcissists developing out of nowhere at 80 based on their environment. These things are, you see the enduring pattern across the lifespan, and they don't seem to really change very much unless they try really hard.
Would you consider the whole epigenetic component pseudoscience or pop psychology?
No, I mean, epigenetics is really, it's a real phenomenon. It's just not this idea that people think it is, where like you can create a narcissist through epigenetic mechanisms, and then you can uncreate one by turning on and off genes at will, or based on changing their environment. We see this in legal system, in the justice system. If somebody has a personality disorder, and oftentimes, there's a like the population of, let's say, antisocial personalities incarcerated, they don't stop being antisocial when they're incarcerated. And that environment is one of the environments that I think would whip most people into shape. The structure and the discipline and the punishment, and they just seem to find other ways to keep being the way they are.
Right. And the thing I've heard with the epigenetics is they've done studies like with the people from the Holocaust, and some of the trait expression in the next generations was a little bit different. So how would you explain something like that? Like, would you just say it's not a big enough sample size, or?
There isn't enough research that it can really validate that. I'm not denying that that's not somebody's, I don't want to say that's not been someone's experience, but if you just look at the research, again, it's been blown out of proportion, this idea of intergenerational transmission of trauma. it's just not necessarily as empirically validated as people think it is.
Okay. I think that's good for people to know too, because there are some wholehearted believers in it. I know that.
Well, and for the record, I know a lot of people don't know this about me personally, but my doctoral dissertation was all about prenatal attachment influences. And so I had to write a lot about epigenetics and research intergenerational transmission because, the intrauterine environment is the first biochemical environment. It's the first environment of a human being. And so I'm very well versed in that research. I'm not just deciding I don't like it because it's not convenient. I've done a lot of research on that, and so there just really isn't enough. If you look at the original sources, it's just not. It's not. There's a lot of generalizations made that are blown out of proportion.
That's understandable. The other thing you made me think of too, you mentioned how we're not seeing narcissists pop up at the age of 80 years old. Some people think, oh, can you become a narcissist like in your teenage years or as an adult? And to me, especially considering 77% has to have that genetic component, like that's there from birth. Like the stuff is there from birth. And then people have criticized me, and I guess by extension you, by saying, oh, he's saying toddlers can be narcissists. It's like, well, they have the innate traits that would be there to make that person a narcissist later in life. But what do you say to that?
If anybody denies that toddlers have different temperaments, that some children are certain ways and others are not, if anyone denies that's like from birth, go to a hospital and go spend some time with newborns. Talk to some nurses. You will see how vastly different the moment they're delivered into the world, their temperaments are, their mannerisms, their tendencies, their emotion regulation capacity from the start. So it's not just that narcissistic traits there's a trait profile that people are vulnerable to and that can develop over time from birth. It's not just narcissistic, it's traits. It's all kinds of temperamental traits. So what I'm saying is that the research shows that in order for an environment to be a risk factor for narcissism, there needs to be a predisposed susceptibility or vulnerability in the trait profile of the person before any environmental experience takes place. And we can see this in siblings. We can see it in twins. We can see it. I mean, kids are just different. And then the argument is, well, it's because their parents raised them very differently. I don't believe that families are a force that's systematic enough that way to produce such extreme differences in under the same roof. Like that would require somebody to be one way with one kid all the time and then another way with another kid all the time. It's just not powerful enough to create a personality disorder. Right. But yeah, we have temperamental, and they've even done research. They've put little non-invasive helmets with electrodes on infants' brains, and it can see how they interact socially. It can see how they regulate emotion. I mean, there's ways to test it now.
Right. Anything but blame the inherent traits is what they want to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's that big of a deal. Like, I think the closer we get, we've had this conversation before. Schizophrenia, autism, ADHD, these were all thought to be the direct result of like cold, unemotional parents. And then as time went on and we could objectively test those theories, turns out there are high genetic components to those things. That's a good thing because now we know how to treat those disorders better. And I think it's going to hopefully be just a matter of time that we can learn how to manage these personality disorders better. That would be good for everyone, including the disordered personality, because, they do experience distress because the way they are is problematic, so I'm sure that if they could be a different way and they could find a way to understand that what they're doing is a problem, that would be good for us. But we have to identify the actual cause. We can't just keep speculating and saying I don't really think it's been done very much good for anyone to keep this whole trauma theory alive when it comes to narcissism. I mean, for a theory to be effective, it has to produce positive outcomes and be good. I'm not seeing that it's very helpful.
I would agree. What do you think about the people who say talking about narcissistic abuse is creating stigma against narcissists and making it more difficult for them to get treatment? What would you say about that?
That's definitely not true, that it's making it more difficult for them to get treatment. Absolutely not. I think that's ridiculous. I don't believe that. I just think all of that's ridiculous, actually.
Because that is something that I do hear, in particular from some of the quote unquote self aware narcissists out there. They'll say, you guys are just perpetuating the stigma, and there's no such thing as narcissistic abuse, etc.
I read this article the other day that kind of floored me, because it was written by a psychologist who said, you don't want to call someone a psychopath, because there's a stigma to that term. What you want to do is, if somebody that you dated was a psychopath, you want to say something like, my ex frequently monitored my phone without my permission. I'm like, are you kidding me? No.
Woke therapy.
Seriously. Like, so now we're not even allowed to call, somebody what they are, or use descriptive terms to explain how someone is being. We're not allowed to do that because it might hurt their feelings. That's silly. I mean, I just don't know how we're going to describe things and get people to understand it if we don't use terms that are descriptive terms. I don't know. I don't think we should avoid describing things with words.
I definitely agree. And my opinion also has been, any disorder that has a lot of people in it that are harming others, there should probably be a little bit of stigma attached to something like that. It's like, if a lot of people who are psychopaths are doing these wild things, or even narcissists and borderlines, that those behaviors, there should be some stigma involved in that. And if a lot of people with the disorder are doing those behaviors, that's a problem. And that's how I would see it.
I agree. I think there should. I think there should be. They should be ashamed of some of their behavior, and so there should be a stigma associated with shameful behavior.
Exactly. I mean, and that's what Dr. Simon would say too, right? He wants people to be more affirmed for their good deeds, the things they've actually done, as opposed to the things that they had no power and control over, like their looks or how tall they are, etc.
Right.
It's about, that's his character stuff, right? He wants people to be getting rewarded more for character as opposed to things they didn't earn.
Exactly.
And I think that would go a far way. But I guess we got to wrap up here in a second, but what is the title of your book again?
The new one is called Traumatic Cognitive Dissonance, How to Heal from an Abusive Relationship with a Disordered Personality. And I believe it's now available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble.
So it is available now?
Yeah, I believe so. I think it was released yesterday. So okay,
I wanted to make sure of that. And people can find you on Instagram at Dr. Peter Salerno, also on YouTube too, Dr. Peter Salerno.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. And I guess the last thing, because we have 2 minutes here left.
Yeah.
The lingering upset effect. I really liked that term that you created because I think it really appropriately describes the circumstance. But what is that?
So basically, that's my way of saying that when you walk away from a confrontation or a conflict, that with a person who's not disordered, you don't necessarily walk away feeling like you're like infected with something, or like there's like this lingering upset. But when you are in a conversation or a dynamic with somebody who is intentionally manipulating you and escalating drama and not collaborating with you, there's actually, their intent is to leave you in like a state of ambiguity or like bewilderment, so that you eventually, so that you question what just happened. And also it's just a well-known fact, if you've ever dealt with these individuals, that they kind of leave something with you when you walk away from them. It's not something that you can just cut off and get on with your day. It's just sort of almost like you caught the flu in a way.
And that's why I thought it was such a great way to describe it, because it makes people's heads spin between the antagonism, belittling, put downs, challenging, critical, and you just don't know up from down and left from right. And you're wondering, oh, what the heck happened here? Is it my fault? What could I have said differently? Why am I so upset on the inside? And describing that as the lingering upset effect, I think that's perfect.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like you can't really just walk away unscathed from those encounters.
Absolutely. But all right, Dr. Salerno, I really appreciate you coming back on the show here, and I'm sure everyone will enjoy this too. And you have a great rest of your day here.
Thank you. You too, Jared.
All right, you have a good one.
All right.
I think